Hello again, fourth graders. Miss Faulkner here with your lesson 12. We are now in Module 6, Topic D, which is using addition to solve problems with fractions and decimals. And our goal for today is that by the end of Lesson 12, we will be able to apply understanding of fraction equivalence to add tenths and hundredths. So our first problem here is to add tenths and hundredths written in unit form using pictorial models. So we are going to use a place value chart and an area model to add 3 tenths and 4 hundredths. And even though it just says pictorial models, after we do our place value chart and our area model, we are also going to go ahead and use multiplication to find equivalent fractions and add 3 tenths and 4 hundredths. So we want to add 3 tenths and 4 hundredths, and we want to figure out what the sum of those is in hundredths. 3 tenths and 4 hundredths altogether, the sum is how many hundredths? We can use a place value chart to help us to figure this out. So we can start with 3 tenths. We have 3 units in the tenths place, and we have 4 units in our hundredths place to start out with. Now we know that 10 hundredths bundles and makes a tenth, which means that for each tenth that we have, we can unbundle it for 10 hundredths. So we're going to take a look at our 3 tenths that we have, and each one of those we can unbundle for 10 hundredths. So our first tenth that we have, let's go ahead and unbundle that for 10 hundredths. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So we unbundled our first tenth for 10 hundredths, and then we can unbundle our next tenth for 10 more hundredths. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. All right, and then we can unbundle our last tenth for 10 more hundredths. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And we've unbundled that last tenth for 10 hundredths. So we were able to unbundle 3 tenths for 30 hundredths. But we already have 4 hundredths there, which means that altogether we now have 34 hundredths. We unbundled 3 tenths for 30 hundredths, and we already had 4 hundredths. So that makes 34 hundredths using our place value chart. What about our area model? We can also add using our area model. So we want to shade in 3 tenths, and then we want to shade in 4 hundredths. So to get those hundredths, I need to partition my tenth into 10 more equal parts. All right, now I have my tenth partitioned into 10 more equal parts, which means now it is in hundredths, and so I can shade in those 4 hundredths. But how many hundredths does that give me in all? Well, I know that each tenth is 10 hundredths. So if I shade in 3 tenths and then my additional 4 hundredths, I have 10 hundredths, 20 hundredths, 30 hundredths, 34 hundredths. So with my area model here, I also see that I have shaded in 34 hundredths. Whether I used my place value chart or my area model, I was able to add 3 tenths and 4 hundredths to get 34 hundredths. And we do want to connect that back to multiplication and finding those equivalent fractions. So if we are trying to do 3 tenths plus 4 hundredths, we should first notice that they have different denominators. And I can only add fractions that have the same denominator. So I need to convert 3 tenths to be in hundredths so that I can add them, because I can only add fractions when they have the same denominator. So my 3 tenths, how many hundredths would that be? Let's find an equivalent fraction. So I know that for my denominator, 10 times 10 would give me 100, which means that I also need to multiply my numerator by 10, because that would give us a fraction equal to 1 whole, and anything times 1 is itself. 3 times 10 gives me 30 for my numerator. So 3/10 is equal to 30 hundredths. Then I would be able to add 30 hundredths and 4 hundredths to get a sum of 34 hundredths. But you can only add fractions if they have the same denominator. So here I had to convert them to have the same denominator and both be in hundredths. Our next problem that we want to do is to add tenths and hundredths by converting using multiplication, which is what we just did. Express the sum as a decimal. So we have fractions right now, but when we find our sum, we will want to rewrite it in decimal form. One of the first things that I should notice right now is that I have the units tenths here and hundredths here. And I can only add my fractions if they have the same denominator, if they are in the same units, which means that my 3/10 here, I need to convert that into my hundredths. And we did this above, and we found that 3/10, if I multiply that by 10/10, which is equal to 1 whole, and anything times 1 is itself, that would give us an equivalent fraction of 30 hundredths. So this 3/10 is equal to 30 hundredths. Those are equivalent fractions. And then 30 hundredths we can then add to 13 hundredths, because 30 hundredths and 13 hundredths, now they have the same denominator. They are in the same units, which means that I can add them. And we also know that when we add fractions, we leave the denominator alone because that tells us how many equal parts our whole is partitioned into. So that doesn't change. We just leave that alone. And then our numerator is what we add. 30 plus 13 gives us 43. So 30 hundredths plus 13 hundredths gives us 43 hundredths. To be writing 43 hundredths as a decimal, because it says express the sum as a decimal, I'm going to be using my place value chart. I am also going to be using a number bond to figure out how many tenths and how many hundredths I have. So my 43 hundredths here, I can decompose that as 40 hundredths. I know that 40 hundredths is equivalent to 4 tenths. Because if we were to write an equivalent fraction equation, 40 hundredths, if we were to divide both our numerator and denominator by 10, I know that 40 hundredths is equal to 4 tenths. So 40 hundredths is equal to 4 tenths, and then I have 3 hundredths. I have 3 hundredths, so 40 hundredths and 3 hundredths. That 40 hundredths is equal to 4 tenths, which means that I will have 4 units in my tenths place, and then I have 3 hundredths. So 43 hundredths is 4 tenths and 3 hundredths, and the way that I would write this as a decimal is 0.43, with 4 units in the tenths place and 3 units in the hundredths place. Problem 3 is to add tenths and hundredths with sums greater than 1 and to express the sum as a decimal. So once again, we have fractions right now. We are going to add them to find the sum and then rewrite our answer as a decimal. Again, one of the first things that I should notice is that I have different denominators. I have 6 tenths and 57 hundredths, so I'm working in different units here. I have tenths and I have hundredths, and I can only add fractions if they have the same denominator. So that means that my 6 tenths here, I am going to need to convert that into an equivalent fraction in hundredths in order to be able to add these fractions together. So 6 tenths, how many hundredths would that be? Let's write our equivalent fraction equation. I want to rewrite this as hundredths. I know that for my denominator, 10 times 10 would give me 100. So for my numerator, I also need to multiply by 10 because 10 tenths is 1 and anything times 1 is itself, which means they're equivalent. 6 times 10 would give me 60 for my numerator. So 6 tenths is equal to 60 hundredths. They are equivalent. And now we can add that to 57 hundredths because they are in the same unit right now. They are both in hundredths, which means that we can add them. I know that when I add my fractions, I leave my denominator alone and I add my numerators. So I need to do 60 plus 57. I'm going to write that off to the side here. 60 plus 57. All right, 0 ones plus 7 ones is 7 ones. 6 tens plus 5 tens is 11 tens. I would bundle 10 of those together to make 100, and I would be left with 110. Carry my 1 to the hundredths place, and then I have 100. So 60 plus 57 gives me 117. 117. So now I have 117 hundredths. I have found my sum, but now I want to rewrite it as a decimal because the directions say to express the sum as a decimal. I probably need a place value chart to do that. All right, I've got my place value chart, but now I need to figure out how many ones, how many tenths, and how many hundredths I have. So I am going to use a number bond to figure that out. So my 117 hundredths here, I know that it takes 100 hundredths to make 1. So I can decompose that as 100 hundredths, which will give me 1. So I know that I have 1 unit in the ones place, and then I have 17 hundredths. But how many tenths and how many hundredths would that give me? Well, my 17 hundredths, I could decompose that into 10 hundredths, which is equal to 1 tenth. 10 hundredths and 1 tenth are equivalent, and 7 hundredths. So altogether, I have 100 hundredths, which is 1, 10 hundredths, which is 1 tenth, and 7 hundredths. So if I put that on my place value chart, I have 1 unit in the ones place because that's my 100 hundredths is 1. So I have 1 unit in the ones place. And then my 10 hundredths makes 1 tenth. So I have 1 unit in the tenths place. And then I have my 7 hundredths remaining. So I have 7 units in the hundredths place. And I can't forget my decimal point in between my ones and my tenths. So if I decompose 117 hundredths, I get 1, 1 tenth, and 7 hundredths. So 117 hundredths, as a decimal, that would be 1.17, 1 and 17 hundredths, which is 1, 1 tenth, and 7 hundredths. So I'd really recommend using number bonds and place value charts to help you out with these problems. I have one last problem for us to look at, and that is 9 tenths plus 64 hundredths. We are going to add these and then record this as a decimal, record our sum as a decimal. So our 9 tenths, we would need to rewrite that in hundredths, and 9 tenths is equivalent to 90 hundredths plus 64 hundredths. How many hundredths would that give us? Well, we need to do 90 plus 64 for our numerator to see how many hundredths that is. So I'm going to write that off to the side here, 90 plus 64. 0 ones plus 4 ones is 4 ones. 9 tens plus 6 tens is 15 tens. So I bundle 10 to make 100, and I have 5 remaining. Carry 1 to the hundredths place. So that is 154. So I have 154 hundredths. 154 hundredths, but I want to write this as a decimal. So my 154 hundredths, I can decompose that as 100 hundredths, which is 1, and 54 hundredths. So I have 1 whole, or 1 1, and 54 hundredths. So if I were to write that as a mixed number, that would be 1 and 54 hundredths. But if I wanted to write this as a decimal, I do need to break it down a little bit further and see how many tenths and how many hundredths that would be. So my 54 hundredths, I can decompose that even further into 50 hundredths, which is equivalent to 5 tenths, and 4 hundredths. So now I've got my ones, my tenths, and my hundredths, and I would be able to write this as a decimal using a place value chart. I have my place value chart, and now I can write my number on my place value chart. I see that these 100 hundredths makes 1, 50 hundredths makes 5 tenths, and 4 hundredths. So as a decimal, my 1 and 54 hundredths would be 1.54, which is 1 and 54 hundredths, or 1, 5 tenths, and 4 hundredths. Our goal that we started with at the beginning of lesson 12 was that we would be able to apply understanding of fraction equivalence to add tenths and hundredths. So we have found a few different ways we can do that using a place value chart, using our area model, or using multiplication to find equivalent fractions to be able to add our tenths and our hundredths. Please let us know if you have any more questions about lesson 12, and we are looking forward to seeing your lesson 12 problem sets.